Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. Whispers of the Unseen. The sun hung low on the horizon, draping the cobblestone streets of St. Cassian with molten gold. Nestled in the heart of an old European town, the city thrummed with life. Flower vendors called out their wares, street performers twirled and leaped, and cafe patrons leaned back in wrought iron chairs, sipping strong espresso. The smell of freshly baked bread and faintly bitter coffee mingled with the scent of roses from a nearby stall. Elena stood at the edge of the square, her camera poised to capture a violinist playing a haunting melody. Her olive green scarf fluttered in the breeze as she adjusted the focus. She had always been an observer, a collector of moments. Her friends joked that she preferred her lens to people, and they weren't entirely wrong. It wasn't that Elena disliked company. It was just easier to disappear behind the safety of her camera, letting others live the stories she could only imagine. But today felt different. A shadow moved into her frame, ruining the composition. She sighed, lowering the camera to find the culprit, a man in a tailored navy coat, oblivious to her frustration. His face was half hidden by a cascade of black curls, but his profile was striking. Sharp jawline, aquiline nose, and eyes that glinted with mischief, even at a distance. He wasn't watching the violinist. He was watching her. "Do I owe you an apology?" he asked, his voice carrying over the hum of the square. Elena blinked. She wasn't used to being addressed so directly. "Not unless you stepped on my shot on purpose." "Ah," he said, smiling. "Then I suppose I do owe you one. Or maybe I just wanted to see what you were capturing." She raised an eyebrow, her defenses flaring. "And what makes you think I'd show you?" "I'll trade you," he said, pulling a small sketchbook from his pocket. "Your photo for my sketch. A fair exchange of art." Elena hesitated. The town square bustled around them, but the moment felt strangely still. Curiosity got the better of her. "All right," she said, flipping her camera to show him the shot. The man leaned closer, his expression softening as he took in the image. "Beautiful," he murmured. "You've caught something most people wouldn't notice." Elena found herself unexpectedly pleased by his reaction. "Your turn," she said, holding out her hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed the sketchbook in her palm. The drawing was exquisite, charcoal lines capturing the square with a vividness that felt alive. But her breath caught when she noticed the tiny figure in the corner of the page. It was unmistakably her, camera in hand, framed in a halo of light. "You drew this before you met me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, though his smile was laced with something unspoken. "Maybe I have a knack for predicting what, or who, I'll find." Elena didn't know whether to laugh or feel unnerved. "Who are you?" she asked. "Call me Luca," he said, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. "And you are? Elena. Well, Elena, how about I buy you a coffee? Seems like the least I can do after interrupting your work." Against her better judgment, she nodded. Something about him was disarming, as though he were a thread unraveling the fabric of her carefully ordered world. They talked until the cafe emptied, the sky turning indigo as stars emerged one by one. Luca had a way of drawing her out, his questions peeling back layers she rarely shared. He spoke of travels to distant cities, of sunrises over mountains and laughter in crowded bazaars. Elena found herself opening up too, recounting childhood summers spent with her grandmother, her love for forgotten corners of the world, and her dream of creating a photo series that could capture the essence of a place in a single frame. As they parted ways, Luca pressed his sketchbook into her hands. "Hold on to this," he said. "I'll find you when I need it back." Before she could protest, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving her clutching the worn leather cover. She flipped through it on her way home, marveling at his talent. The last page, however, stopped her cold. It was a drawing of an alleyway she recognized, one near her apartment. The lines were detailed, the shadows stark, but it was what stood in the foreground that made her blood run cold. A figure stood there, cloaked in darkness, with a single outstretched hand, and below it, in Luca's neat handwriting, was a single date, tomorrow's. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Alley. Elena hardly slept that night. The drawing haunted her, its lines etched into her mind like a warning she couldn't ignore. By morning, the usual comfort of her routines felt frayed, every sound and shadow laced with unease. She clutched Luca's sketchbook as she walked to her studio, her steps slower than usual, her eyes darting to every alleyway she passed. She wanted to convince herself that the drawing was a coincidence, some harmless flight of Luca's artistic imagination. But the date beneath it clung to her like a curse. Her studio, a sunlit space cluttered with lenses, rolls of film, and photographs pinned to corkboards, usually felt like a sanctuary. Today, it felt suffocating. She tried to distract herself by developing photos from the previous day. As the images took shape, she paused, her breath catching. In the corner of one shot, the violinist framed perfectly in the square, was Luca. Not just standing there, but looking directly at her camera. The detail was sharp, his dark curls, the glint of his watch, and that half-smile she'd come to recognize. But she swore she hadn't noticed him before he spoke to her. She grabbed her phone and scrolled to the messages with her closest friend, Anna. "I think I met someone strange yesterday." "Define strange. Cute or creepy?" "Both. Can I call you?" But before Anna could reply, Elena heard the faint chime of her studio's doorbell. She froze, her heart hammering. Visitors weren't uncommon. She occasionally had walk-ins curious about her work, but something about the timing sent a chill down her spine. "Hello," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. No one answered. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the frosted glass. The silhouette of a man stood outside, tall and motionless. She gripped the handle, debating whether to open it, when the figure suddenly stepped back and disappeared down the street. Elena's hands trembled as she locked the door. She couldn't shake the feeling that it had been Luca. The day dragged on, each moment heavier than the last. By evening, the city's golden glow was replaced by the cold blue of twilight. Elena told herself she was being ridiculous, but the sketchbook in her bag seemed to pulse with its own gravity, as if daring her to confront the truth. Finally, unable to resist, she found herself walking toward the alley from the drawing. The narrow passage was as she remembered it, walls weathered with time, the faint scent of damp stone clinging to the air. She stepped into its shadows, her pulse quickening. At first, there was nothing unusual. The alley was empty, silent except for the distant hum of traffic. And then she saw him. Luca stood at the far end, leaning casually against the wall as if he'd been waiting for her. His sketchbook was in his hand, though she still had the one he'd given her. "How did you know I'd come here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He straightened, his expression unreadable. "Because I asked you to hold on to something of mine." Elena tightened her grip on her bag. "What does that have to do with this?" She gestured around them, her frustration mounting. "You drew this alley, Luca. You wrote today's date. What are you playing at?" Luca stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. For the first time, she noticed something unusual in his eyes, an almost otherworldly glimmer that made her both curious and uneasy. "I didn't draw that alley because of what I imagined," he said softly. "I drew it because of what I've seen." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I see things, Elena," he continued, his voice tinged with sadness. "Things that haven't happened yet, moments frozen in time, waiting to unfold. It's why I sketch, so I can make sense of them." She shook her head, stepping back. "That's ridiculous. You can't expect me to believe that." "You don't have to." Luca's gaze flicked to her bag. "But you've seen enough to know I'm not lying. The figure in the drawing, did you look at it closely?" Elena's stomach twisted. She hadn't dared to. With trembling hands, she opened the sketchbook and flipped to the page. Her eyes lingered on the figure this time, its details sharper than she remembered. The shadowy form had no face, but its outstretched hand was unmistakably reaching toward something, or someone. "What does it mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Luca hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It means someone's about to make a choice they can't take back, and you're the one who has to decide." The words sent a shiver down her spine. "Decide what?" Before Luca could answer, a gust of wind tore through the alley, extinguishing the street lamp overhead. Darkness swallowed them, and Elena's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone. When the light from her screen illuminated the space, Luca was gone. And she wasn't alone. At the far end of the alley, the shadowy figure from the sketch now stood in chilling clarity, its hand still outstretched. Choose, it said, its voice a hollow echo. Chapter 3. The Choice. Elena's breath hitched as the figure moved closer, its steps eerily silent. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, pressing against her chest as if the alley itself were collapsing inward. Choose, the figure repeated, its voice reverberating as if it were coming from everywhere at once. What choice? Elena demanded, clutching the sketchbook to her chest like a shield. The figure tilted its head, its faceless form somehow exuding a strange mix of patience and urgency. The choice has already been made once. Now it must be made again. The words made no sense, but before Elena could question them, a flicker of movement in her periphery made her whirl around. Luca was back, standing a few feet away, his expression grim. "Luca!" she exclaimed, her relief overwhelming. "What's happening? What does it want?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the figure, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. "It's not here for me, Elena. It's here for you." "Me?" Her voice cracked. "Why me? I don't even know what's going on." Luca stepped closer, his tone low but urgent. "You need to listen to me. That thing, it isn't just a shadow. It's a fragment of something bigger, something that exists outside of time. It's drawn to crossroads, to moments where a single decision can ripple outward and change everything." Elena stared at him, her mind reeling. "You're saying this thing is here because of some choice I have to make?" "Yes," Luca said, "and whatever you choose will shape not just your future, but mine as well. Maybe even this entire town's." Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stay upright. "And what exactly am I supposed to choose?" The shadow shifted slightly, its outstretched hand now pointed toward the sketchbook she was holding. Luca's expression darkened. "It wants the book," he said quietly. Elena clutched it tighter. "Why?" "Because it's a record of things that were never meant to be seen," Luca replied. "The drawings, my drawings, they're fragments of the future, glimpses of possibilities. If it takes the book, those possibilities will collapse into one." "Is that bad?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It depends on what you value," Luca said, his tone grave. "Giving it the book means the path forward will be clear and unchangeable, but it also means losing the freedom to shape your own story. Keeping the book means preserving choice, but at a cost. You'll carry the weight of uncertainty, of not knowing what comes next, and there will be consequences. For both of us." Elena's mind raced. This was impossible. How could she make a decision like this with so little to go on? She looked at Luca, searching his face for answers. "What would you do?" He hesitated, and for the first time, she saw vulnerability in his eyes. "It's not my choice to make," he said, "but I need you to know something. If you keep the book, it's not just your future you're protecting. It's mine too." Her heart twisted at the unspoken plea in his voice. But then she turned back to the shadow, its presence colder and heavier now, as if it could sense her hesitation. "What happens if I give it the book?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The shadow seemed to ripple, its form shifting subtly. "A single truth, a single path," it said. "You will know where your story ends." Elena shivered. Knowing the future sounded tempting, safe even, but it also felt suffocating, like a cage disguised as clarity. Her gaze dropped to the sketchbook in her hands. Luca's drawings had already shown her things she couldn't explain, glimpses of a world she didn't fully understand. But they were more than just predictions. They were pieces of his soul, moments captured with an artist's love for detail and possibility. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. Then, with trembling hands, she made her choice. When she opened her eyes, the shadow was gone. The alley was empty, save for Luca, who stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. "What? What did you do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena held out the sketchbook, its pages blank. Every drawing, every trace of Luca's visions had vanished. "I kept it," she said, "but it's gone now. The book is just a book." Luca stared at her, his expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. "You severed the thread," he murmured. "You chose freedom." She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "Did I make the right choice?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "There's no such thing as the right choice. Only the one you're willing to live with." Elena's heart ached at the weight of his words. The connection between them, the strange, tenuous bond forged in that alley, felt different now, as if something fragile had been lost. but something new had taken its place. "What happens now?" she asked. Luca took a deep breath, his gaze softening. "Now, we live without knowing, and maybe that's the way it's supposed to be." As they left the alley together, the future stretched before them, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. Chapter 4. Echoes of What Could Have Been. Days turned into weeks, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her choice had set something in motion. The sketchbook remained on her desk, its once vibrant pages eerily blank. She'd tried everything, shining light on it, tracing over its pages with pencil, even whispering Luca's name to it in the quiet hours of the night, but whatever magic it had held was gone. Luca, however, stayed. At first, he seemed distant, his usual easy charm tempered by something heavier, something Elena couldn't name. He visited her studio often, sitting quietly as she developed photos or tinkered with her camera equipment. It was as if he needed to be near her, though he never explained why. One evening, as twilight bathed the city in shades of lavender and gold, Luca finally spoke. "Do you ever wonder what was in the pages?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the sketchbook. Elena set down her camera, wiping her hands on a rag. "All the time," she admitted. "But I'm not sure I want to know anymore. Isn't that the point? To let the future unfold naturally?" He gave her a small, bittersweet smile. "That's what you chose, but not knowing doesn't mean forgetting. I remember every drawing, every possibility." Her heart sank. She hadn't considered that Luca's memory might still be burdened with the visions that had vanished from the book. "Do you regret giving it to me?" He shook his head. "No. You're the first person who's ever understood what it's like to carry those images. I couldn't have done it alone." His words were both a comfort and a weight. Elena wanted to say something, anything, to lighten the mood. But before she could, Luca stood abruptly. "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand. She hesitated. "Where?" "Somewhere we can rewrite the story," he said cryptically. They wound through the narrow streets of St. Cassian, Luca leading her with a sense of purpose that bordered on urgency. The air was crisp, the scent of autumn leaves mingling with the faint aroma of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor. Finally, they arrived at an abandoned chapel on the edge of town. Its once majestic spire was crooked, and ivy crawled up its weathered stone walls. Luca pushed open the heavy wooden door, its creak echoing in the stillness. The inside was eerily beautiful, dust motes swirling in the fading light that streamed through shattered stained glass windows. At the center of the room stood an old altar, its surface covered in carvings too worn to decipher. Luca walked toward it, his movements deliberate. "This place is older than the town," he said, running his fingers over the carvings. "They say it was built on a fault line, one where time itself splits." Elena frowned, her unease growing. "What are we doing here, Luca?" He turned to face her, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "The shadow might be gone, but the choices it presented don't just disappear. They leave echoes." "Elena, I need to know if you'd make the same choice again," he said softly. Her chest tightened. "Why does it matter? The book is empty now. It's over." Luca shook his head. "It's not over. Not for me." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You don't understand what you saved me from by keeping that book. Those drawings, they weren't just predictions. They were pieces of my life, choices I'd already made, or thought I had to make. When you severed the thread, you gave me back my freedom. But sometimes I wonder, what if the path I was on was the one I was supposed to follow?" Elena stared at him, her thoughts racing. "You think I made the wrong choice?" "No," he said quickly. "But I need to see it, to understand what could have been." Without another word, he placed his hands on the altar. A low hum filled the air, and the carvings began to glow faintly. The light was soft at first, like embers in the dark, but it grew brighter, spilling across the room until Elena had to shield her eyes. When the light faded, the chapel was gone. They stood in a vast, endless expanse of white, the air thick with a strange stillness. Floating before them were dozens of translucent orbs, each one swirling with images that shifted too quickly to comprehend. "What is this?" Elena whispered. "The echoes," Luca said, his voice laced with awe. "Every possibility that was lost when the book emptied." He reached out, his fingers brushing against one of the orbs. It expanded instantly, its images slowing until they became clear. Elena gasped. Inside the orb, she saw herself standing in a different version of the alley, hit the shadow looming over her. But this time, she handed it the sketchbook. The shadow absorbed it, and the world around her seemed to shift. People disappearing, buildings changing, the town unraveling and reforming in ways that felt wrong. Luca's voice broke through her thoughts. This is what might have been if you'd given it the book. She turned to him. And the other orbs? He gestured toward them. Each one shows a different path, a different version of us. Elena hesitated, her gaze darting between the orbs. Do we really need to see this? Luca's expression softened. Maybe not. But don't you wonder? Don't you want to know if we were always meant to find each other? Her breath caught at the vulnerability in his voice. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. I don't need a vision to tell me that, Luca. I already know. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the weight of his burden lift, if only slightly. As the orbs began to fade, the white expanse dissolved, leaving them back in the chapel. The hum of the altar grew faint, then stopped altogether. Luca turned to her, his smile faint but genuine. Thank you, Elena, for choosing me, for choosing us. She smiled back, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. I think we're the ones who get to write the story now. And as they walked out of the chapel, hand in hand, the future stretched before them, unknown, unwritten, and beautifully their own. Chapter 5. Threads of Fate. Life after the chapel felt like a fragile balancing act, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Elena and Luca tried to slip back into a semblance of normalcy, but the experience had left its mark. Though they avoided discussing the orbs and the shadows, the unspoken weight lingered between them. Elena returned to her photography, finding solace in the click of the shutter and the quiet intimacy of framing a moment. Luca, meanwhile, threw himself into sketching again, though his drawings were different now, less precise, more abstract, as if he were relearning how to let his imagination wander without the burden of foresight. But the sense of peace was short-lived. One evening, as Elena developed photos in her studio, she noticed something strange. Among the images from her latest outing, a series of candid shots taken near the old market, one stood out. It was a picture of a man walking through a crowd, his face turned slightly toward the camera. It was Luca. At first, she thought nothing of it. Luca often accompanied her on her photo walks, blending into the background as she worked. But the more she stared at the photo, the more something felt off. Luca's expression in the image wasn't one she recognized. There was a hardness in his gaze, a grim determination that sent a chill down her spine. And then she noticed the date imprinted in the corner. 3 days from now. Her hands trembled as she set the photo down. This can't be right, she whispered. She hadn't taken the photo. When Luca arrived at her studio later that night, Elena wasted no time showing him the image. Do you remember this? She asked, sliding the photo across the table. He studied it for a long moment, his brow furrowed. No, he said finally, but if it's 3 days from now, I wouldn't. Elena paced the room, her mind racing. I don't understand. The sketchbook is empty. The shadow is gone. How is this happening? Luca's expression darkened. Maybe the shadow wasn't the only thing tied to the book. Maybe whatever created those visions left something behind. Something behind? Like what? He hesitated, then said, a thread, a fragment of the future that's still trying to weave itself into the present. Elena shook her head. No, we broke that. We chose freedom. This isn't supposed to happen anymore. Freedom doesn't erase the past, Luca said quietly. And it doesn't erase the echoes of what might have been. The words sent a shiver through her. She sank into a chair, staring at the photo as if it might offer answers. So what do we do? Wait and see if it happens? No, Luca said firmly. We stop it before it does. The next 3 days were a blur of research and restless anticipation. Luca pored over old maps and folklore about St. Cassian, searching for any clue that might explain the photo. Elena scoured her negatives, hoping for some technical error that could explain the impossible image. But the truth came to them in an unexpected way. On the eve of the 3rd day, Luca's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text was simple, almost mundane. Meet me at the old clock tower, midnight. But attached to it was a picture, another photograph of Luca, taken from behind as he walked toward the clock tower. The timestamp was an hour in the future. Elena insisted on coming with him despite Luca's protests. "This isn't your fight," he argued as they approached the towering silhouette of the clock tower, its spire piercing the starless night. "Don't you dare say that," she shot back. "We're in this together. I chose you, remember? Whatever this is, we face it as a team." Luca gave her a small, weary smile. "I don't deserve you." They reached the clock tower just before midnight. The air was colder here, heavy with the weight of something unseen. Luca hesitated at the entrance, his hand brushing against the iron door. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No," Elena admitted. "But let's go anyway." The interior of the clock tower was dark and cavernous, the faint scent of rust and oil lingering in the air. Their footsteps echoed as they climbed the winding staircase, each step pulling them closer to whatever waited at the top. When they emerged into the clock chamber, they weren't alone. Standing in the center of the room, bathed in the pale light of the moon, was Luca, or rather a version of him. Elena gasped, her heart lurching at the sight. This Luca was different. His hair shorter, his posture rigid, his eyes colder than she'd ever seen. He wore a long coat that flared as he turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "Finally," the other Luca said, his voice eerily calm. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Luca stepped forward, shielding Elena with his body. "Who are you?" The other Luca tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Isn't it obvious? I'm you, or at least I'm the you who might have been." Elena's blood ran cold. "The you who might have been? What does that mean?" "It means the thread wasn't entirely severed," the other Luca said, his gaze locking onto hers. "When you chose to keep the book, you created a split, a fracture in time. I'm the part of him that kept walking the path the shadow offered. And now I'm here to finish what was started." "No," Luca said, his voice firm. "We rejected that path. We chose freedom." "Freedom?" The other Luca laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. "You call this freedom? Wandering blindly with no purpose, no direction? That's not freedom. That's chaos." He stepped closer, his presence unnervingly commanding. "But it's not too late. We can still fix this, Fry. All you have to do is let me take back what's mine." "What are you talking about?" Luca demanded. "The book," the other Luca said, his voice a growl now. "It's not just a collection of sketches. It's a key. A way to control the threads of fate. Give it to me, and I'll make sure neither of us ever has to wonder what comes next." Elena stepped forward, her fear giving way to defiance. "No. We're not giving you anything. Luca isn't you anymore. He doesn't need the book, and neither do I." The other Luca's eyes narrowed. "Then you leave me no choice." Before they could react, the clock tower shuddered, the gears groaning as time itself seemed to twist. And then the world fractured. Final chapter. The clock strikes eternity. The air in the clock tower crackled as time splintered around them, fragments of moments swirling like shards of broken glass. Elena clung to Luca's arm as the floor beneath them seemed to waver, caught between solid stone and an endless void. The other Luca, harder, colder, and impossibly sure of himself, stood at the center of the chaos, his figure illuminated by the eerie light spilling from the fractured gears of the clock. His voice, when he spoke, reverberated with a chilling certainty. "Do you see now?" he said, spreading his arms as if to embrace the chaos. "This is the truth of the world without the book. You think you chose freedom, but all you did was unweave the thread holding everything together." Elena's voice trembled, but she refused to back down. "That's not true. We're still here, together. That's proof enough that the world doesn't need your control." The other Luca laughed, his tone sharp and biting. "Together? You think love is enough to stop this?" His gaze turned to Luca. "You of all people should know better. You've felt it, haven't you? The uncertainty, the doubt, the weight of not knowing what comes next." Luca stepped forward, his fists clenched. "I have," he admitted, "but I've also felt something else. Relief. Hope. The chance to be more than just a puppet of some preordained fate." He looked at Elena, his eyes softening. "She gave me that chance." The other Luca's expression darkened, his form flickering for a brief moment, as if destabilized by Luca's words. But he recovered quickly, his voice rising in anger. "Then let me show you what your precious hope will cost." With a sweep of his hand, the room filled with visions, glowing orbs like those in the white expanse they'd seen days before. But these were different. Each one contained not just a possibility, but a consequence. Lives unraveled, relationships destroyed, paths taken and regretted. Elena's breath caught as she saw herself in one orb, standing alone in her studio, her face streaked with tears. In another, Luca was wandering through a desolate St. Cassian, its streets empty, its buildings crumbling. "Every choice you make creates ripples," the other Luca said, his voice heavy with grim satisfaction. "Every ripple destroys something else. That's the truth of freedom. Chaos doesn't build, it only tears apart." Elena felt her knees weaken, doubt clawing at her resolve. But Luca's hand found hers, his grip warm and steady. "He's wrong," Luca said, his voice steady and sure. "Chaos doesn't just destroy, it creates too. Every ripple is a chance for something new, something better." He turned to face his other self, his gaze unwavering. "You think the book gave you control, but it didn't. It trapped you. You were so afraid of making the wrong choice that you stopped living altogether." The other Luca's form flickered again, the light around him dimming slightly. He stepped back, his confidence faltering for the first time. No, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Without control, there's only pain." Elena stepped forward, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. "Without control, there's love, there's growth, there's life. That's what you've forgotten." The other Luca looked at her, his expression shifting from anger to something that almost resembled longing. For a moment, the chaos around them stilled, the shards of time hovering in place as if the world itself was waiting. And then, the other Luca sighed. "Perhaps you're right," he said, his voice softer now. "Perhaps I've forgotten what it means to let go." His figure began to dissolve, the light within him fading as he stepped toward Luca. "But you'll carry this burden now," he said. "Every choice you make, every path you take, it will matter. You can't erase the ripples." Luca nodded, his expression resolute. "I wouldn't want to." The other Luca gave a faint smile before he disappeared completely, the chaos around them collapsing into silence. The clock tower was still again, its gears moving in quiet harmony. The air felt lighter, as if the world itself had been reset. Elena and Luca stood together, their hands still clasped. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luca looked around, his gaze lingering on the restored clock face. "I think so, but I don't think the story ends here." Elena smiled, her heart swelling with hope. "No, it doesn't." They left the clock tower hand in hand, stepping into a night that felt impossibly clear. The stars above seemed brighter, their light a reminder of the infinite possibilities waiting to be written. And as they walked back toward the town, Elena knew one thing for certain. The future wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, one choice at a time.